Sem grandes demoras, vou dar a palavra ao nosso segundo keynote speaker, Andreas Hoppner, professor da University College Dublin, que fará a sua intervenção com o tema Climate Change and the EU Regulatory Response, Absolutely Sustainable Paris-Aligned Investing. Professor Andreas Hoppner, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be in Lisbon the third time. And it's really an amazing city, as I could observe myself. There we go, one step too fast. Two steps too fast. So my name is Andreas Hoppner. I'm a professor at University College Dublin. That's the largest university in Ireland. And we also have very important alumni, the Commissioner for Financial Markets and the Director of FISMA, both UCD alumni. That doesn't mean that we always have exactly the same view as you would read in the press. And I would like to present to you why I think that Article 9 SFDR is actually a green superstar. I wrote a column in Investment Pensions Europe about it, which you can read. We call it Green Lodestar there. But I believe the European Union is on a fantastic trajectory. I hope that the speed of my English is appropriate. I do. Oh, maybe it's not appropriate. I will try my best against all these lights to see people's faces, and if everybody looks entirely puzzled, I will slow down. You can also maybe just make gestures if I'm too fast. The slides will be available for everybody, so we can read after that. So, first as a preamble, is ESG a scam? Maybe occasionally. And are the real-world outcomes actually sustainable? We do have to discuss this. The world's richest man does not only propose a global peace plan, he also comments on ESG. His view, quite simple, Exxon is top 10 in S&P 500 for ESG, and I'm out. That can't be right. Now, Tesla's Scope 3 emissions and supply chain are maybe not perfect, and Tesla's top executive gender diversity is null. He himself calls himself Techno King, and his CFO is literally officially called Master of Coin. No joke. So maybe Tesla is not top 10, but Exxon top 10 is obviously a problem. The measure is too much focused on inputs, in this case Dow Jones, Sustainability Index, not S&P, and too little focus on outputs. We need to move towards real impact outcomes and away from just counting efforts and inputs, because the efforts need to lead to outputs. So his criticism of Exxon is probably right. Tesla might still need to do something about supply chain. Now this is Dilbert, the human character, talking to Dogbert, the dog kind of character, or cat kind of character. So Dilbert wants to pollute, and Dogbert asks Dilbert, how much? And Dilbert says, one non-binary board member is worse. Now, that is the actual problem with ESG, because ESG implies that we got one number, and that number will trade off pollution against non-binary board members, or practically women on the board. Every vendor, MSCI, Sustainalytics, ISS, will in fact have a translation for that. And that is problematic when you look at the input measures, and really leads to the question if it should be ESG or if it should be individual real impact outcomes. And to come to an actual real impact outcome, let us look at gender diversity among top executives in the S&P 500, where it matters most. Board is part-time, we all know that. It's easy to appoint a female professor to board, and many of my colleagues have been appointed, which is good. But top executive is full-time, it's much harder. If we look at the power, not only the headcount, but the power of women in the S&P 500, we find that the male managers, Elon Musk, Larry Ellison, Larry Page, and so forth, own 770 billion in shares. The female own 9. That's a gender power gap of 99 to 1. That obviously is not sustainable. The headcount gap would be 75 to 25. So the real world is not sustainable, and we need to reduce emissions every year 7.6% as countries. That's what the United Nations Emissions Gap Report says. We say from the actual Paris line benchmarks, rounded on 7% every year. But we need to be disciplined reducing the emissions and actually walk the walk, not just talk about walking the walk, but never actually go. Now, that comes to the conclusion of my preamble. ESG ratings have been useful for 20 years, but now we do need to move to real impact outcomes. CO2e emissions, women in top management, water pollution, and so forth. ESG ratings in themselves will have done their job, but they might not be 100% fit for the future, certainly not at top level. Now the next preamble is about financing. The battlefield of sustainable finance, the decisions, if we get anywhere towards Paris or not, are in primary markets. It's financing, in particular refinancing, that matters. Now it's great to see that we have that many green bonds, but green bonds have a fundamental weakness. You won't find enough green activities, even if you declare some gas and some nuclear green. It's a limit there. And so we also, in the SDG literate financing, have Sdg Link Bonds. Sdg Link Bonds, actually not an academic innovation, neither a policy innovation, a commercial innovation. Enel were the ones inventing Sdg Link Bonds in September 2019, an Italian innovation, and an excellent one, I might say this. An Sdg Link Bond means that you have an SDG covenant in a bond contract, the same way that you have liquidity covenants in a bond contract for decades. So you might have a bond that says, I will have 50% gender diversity in top executive by 2030, and if I don't, I pay $1.5 million fine. I will have 7% reduced emissions every year to 2030, and if I don't, I pay $7.5 million fine. That is a real, actual bond from an Australian company putting that forward. So if you think about it, there is strong growth rates. Link bonds have actually had 100 billion issued last year. They are, if they have the fine in the contract, so-called coupon step up, they're legally enforceable, much better than any shareholder activism. You can actually sue them. And they have one other beautiful thing. They customize what matters to the company and their investors much better than any accounting standard ever will. Because they don't standardize, they customize. This investor wants this company to do that. And that's where the beauty comes in. Let me show you some data. This is the SDGs targeted by Sdg Link Bonds as of the first quarter of this year. Green are bonds with a coupon step up, legally enforceable, red are without. Particularly big climate action, industrial innovation, affordable and clean energy. This is the targets. 13.2, the biggest, absolute greenhouse gas reductions, Paris Agreement. 9.4, absolute emission reductions, notably not climate action but economic innovation, the second, then renewable energy. I can also look at this by currencies. You can see Chinese yuan doesn't really work. Or I can look at it by country. Interestingly, Italy, at that point, still in the lead in global issuance, at least in terms of numbers, followed by France. China is still the issue, UK, and even Brazil has already quite a few. So we have a tool now that actually is very simple. It just puts a sustainability covenant in a bond contract, and adds a penalty for missing it. It is as simple as 5 lines of text. It is extremely powerful because of that legally enforceable penalty. It is customizable, and it's infinitely scalable. To me, it's the future of bond issuance. So, we have to talk taxonomy. At this stage, the Green Taxonomy, the second delegated act, is a little bit like defining French fries as salads. Obviously, gas is terribly green, and while nuclear power might be green, nuclear waste is 100,000 years. Possibly green, maybe not. Let me give you an analogy. When New York introduced cars, when they had horses, they thought it was great from a pollution perspective because horse pollution goes downwards and it's smelly. Car pollution goes upwards and it doesn't smell after 2 minutes. We might be thinking the same about nuclear because, let me remind you, the Bronze Age was 5,000 years ago. Nuclear waste is a problem for 100,000. So that's 20 times or 10 times to the Bronze Age and back. Any one of us think that they can make a judgment on that length is possibly overconfident. Now, but we have SFDR. SFDR simplified. Article 9 claims to be walking the walk. So that is actually going on the decarbonization trajectory, or maybe actually going on the gender parity journey upwards. Article 8 claims to be talking the walk. So that is, I tell you that I'll do it, but maybe then I don't do it. It's like me saying, I'll start my diet in January, and then I look exactly the same in March, or even mid-January. Or I quit smoking and I never do it. So now the issue is that it sounds funny, but it has happened for far too long. Most of the managers said we're going to do it, but then they didn't walk it. And of course, Article 6 is you have to do it whether or not you're walking or talking. These ain't my words, these are Alan Decker's words. Most notably, I was wrong. I provoked his words with the wrong words. I had said Article 8 is actually talking the talk. Now, I probably rarely was so pleased to be told wrong. Because if you compare his words with my words, talking the talk, that's okay. But talking the walk, that's potentially misleading. So Alan was actually a lot more accurate. And in an Article 8 sense, if you were then to talk too aggressively, you're not really supposed to do this. So I'm not quoting Alan without reference. Here is the actual discussion, so you can see it evidenced. LinkedIn is a beautiful tool, even for scientific research. Now, where are we? We're on Article 9. And actually, Article 9 has 3 articles that are relevant, 1, 2, and 3. The strongest is 3, that requires you to use the Paris line benchmark. So it tells you how fast to walk, at which pace to decarbonize, and you have to use it. 9.2 is the one without benchmark, so that may or may not work. The supervisors will have to look closely. And 9.1 is the one where you need to use a benchmark that is actually objective aligned, but we hadn't had time yet to develop these benchmarks, right? A gender parity benchmark would be beautiful. European Union just hasn't developed it yet, but it would be the consequence of imitating a Paris line benchmark on diversity. So then these benchmarks are really what drive Article 9. They are like the pacemaker in a marathon. They get you to run at the right speed. And they get you to actually walk the walk rather than just talk about walking but never walk. And you'll be surprised upon reflection how many asset managers realize that they were talking more than they were walking. Sometimes they tell me that privately, quietly. Sometimes they tell me that quite loudly. But then they still realize that they need to walk a little bit more. So 217 is the other part of an Article 9. And that's the next set of beauty. Because that is where we distinguish between activity, company, and investments. And there lies the beauty in what are we looking at. That's kind of the taxonomy, taking only the best parts and moving it in an investment. So here's the difference. I'll start from the top. The economic activity itself needs to have an ability to contribute to a suitable objective. The activity, not the company. That means you're thinking about your investments at an activity level, not in the corporate shell. And you're incentivizing the companies to invest or divest towards the right activities. Second, the investment doesn't need to do significant harm. And that's effectively the activity and the company together, but based on principal adverse indicators that are united across sectors, and we're not having a massive sector mix. And third, and that's the most beauty, good governance. But not any good governance for a 9 that is particular. The particular here is the most important aspect. It is particular management structures, normally governance, but it's also particular good employee relations, good employee remuneration, and good tax structure. And that means that, let me reread this politically as an academic, I use my academic freedom to do this, treat the votes as well, pay the votes as well, and pay your taxes so there is a high chance the incumbent gets re-elected. Makes imminent sense from a political perspective and actually sets a much higher bar. Will Amazon ever qualify for an Article 9 on the employee relations side? Can that really be good employee relations? Invesco is headquartered in Bermuda. Is that a good tax structure? I'm saying this based in Ireland. You could make the same argument about some Irish firms, maybe not all. So there is actually a lot of subtle aspects that really make a difference. And to take an anecdote, the gentleman that now runs, it's a personal story, so he might deny that or not, but in principle, the gentleman who now runs the advice for Biden previously was head of sustainability at BlackRock, and I had a discussion with him and asked him what was his best job in the administration. And it wasn't actually negotiating the Paris Agreement, it was being the head of the budget office, because you can make little technocratic changes that have beautiful impacts. And so I would predict that this particular aspect here, if you can see it, the good governance and the benchmarks will have a lot more impact than, for instance, the economic, the overall objectives. Now, what does absolutely sustainable investing then mean? Well, it means to focus on real impact outcomes. It means to actually be better than the benchmark, and that we've been for a while, but it also means to actually be better than you were yourself last year. And that means walking the walk. And that is where a lot of funds haven't actually been true to their colors. They were better than the benchmark, but they were by no means better than they were last year. It was random if they were better or worse. In a simple narrative, if the benchmark increases emissions, because the planet increased emissions, a fund that is 30% better than the benchmark will increase emissions, just lesser. And so that is what Article 9 beautifully tackles by actually just linking into Paris-aligned benchmarks who prescribe that. They also use Scope 3. They target net zero. And I believe, and we discussed this briefly during lunch, they found a beautiful solution for the problem that we don't have enough time to wait for all the companies to report sustainability information. Because if we wait for all the companies to report sustainability information, we're going to wait a few years for the European ones, we might wait a few years more for the American ones, and we might wait forever for the Russians, for instance. We don't have the time. And that means that we need to change the incentives when it comes to sustainability information. And within Paris-aligned benchmarks, there's a concept that is now repeatedly applied elsewhere in taxonomy and so forth, which is called estimate based on precautionary principle. And that is fundamentally important. That means that if a company reports emissions accurate, you use the emissions. If a company underreports emissions, you estimate a number that's slightly higher than it otherwise would be. And if a company does not report emissions, you estimate a number that's even higher than what it normally would be. Why is this important? If you do a normal estimation based on data that most companies somewhat underreport, your estimation will be underreported. What happens if you confront a company that does not report with an underreported estimation? The top management team will say, why do I spend money on collecting the data and reporting it if I make myself look worse than I currently am? So the only way to create incentives to actually report is to confront companies with estimated numbers that are worse than what they could report themselves. And that precautionary principle is absolutely essential to make the overall process work. Now, just overall, where are we? SFDR Article 9 looks very strong to start with. Paris-aligned benchmarks have had 50+ billion, and that's before New Zealand put the sovereign wealth fund into it, which is another 15 billion, so we're at 65, maybe 70 billion right now. We actually have hundreds of funds following it, and the performance is quite nice, both from a return on investment, ROI perspective, as well as from a real impact outcome, RIO perspective. So we have a path forward. It is based on actually walking the walk, on the discipline of being better every year than you were last year, and then hopefully we'll get somewhere close to a net zero trajectory as we foresaw them in the original report. I hope it was interesting. There will be some time for questions. Thank you very much. Any questions? I scared everybody. I have a lot of appendix that I can just keep talking.
You have mentioned the precautionary principle. How it could be implemented of very different ways. So it means that for a same company, you could have very different approaches.
Yes. The main point is that every approach is higher than what they would report themselves. So there is a very easy test. If I develop a precautionary principle-based estimation, I take the really reported data and I check if using the method that I have developed, 95% of them would be somewhat overestimated. Because the ambition is that the estimation will be overestimated. All the vendors, MSCI, Bloomberg, Sustainalytics, ISS, they estimate anyways, right? We're only telling them that do not estimate a number that's underestimated, because that means the company is unlikely to start reporting. Put forward a number that's overestimated to create the incentive for company to either report better or report. Now, Bloomberg has their method. Clarity Eye puts forward another method. MSCI puts forward another method. Over time, the asset managers will decide which numbers are most accurate. But the most important thing is to avoid the underestimation, because that creates structural disincentives for better data, especially outside the European Union where there's no CSRD. So, and that is a fundamentally different perspective on the estimation than we previously had, because previously you estimate with the pool of data available. That pool of data, as Bloomberg nicely shows, is for 80% of the companies somewhat too low, simply because they can't collect all the emissions, and then you estimate a number for a company that's too low. And then you have a giant problem if you're the environmental manager. You're trying to convince your top management to report. You're trying to get a budget to report by the census measure. And the number which you present will make them look worse in public than the number that's estimated for them by a range of vendors. So the top management team will struggle to think that they should invest in something that makes them look worse, especially if they haven't reported today. Does that make some sense?
You started with that quote by Elon Musk about ratings.
Yeah.
And two questions for you on that, in that respect. A, should one have indexes or benchmarks which are industry specific, or should you just get something which is across the board and then makes it very difficult to compare an oil and gas company or a mining company with an electric car company? The second one is about whether or not these ratings should be more clear in terms of the methodology for investors in general.
So the ratings should be fully transparent on what they do. And there is a good question if there should even be a top rating or if it should just be individual measures. So carbon emissions, women on board, and so forth. So real impact outcomes would mean we just have individual measures and only the asset managers themselves, not the third party, decides how to aggregate. Now, a very important aspect is the question about industry specific. And I have to apologize for taking a technical tour here, but there is no such thing as an industry. Any industry standard that we have is inaccurate. It will be different from another, and the industry standards profoundly have the following problem. Either they are one-to-one, and a one-to-one, like one company, one industry, always forgets 20, 30, sometimes 60% of the company, or like NACE or SIG, they are self-selection. So I, as a European company, can go to NACE and select. Right now, with the green legislation, I must be stupid to select the wrong sector. Italgas holding, top entity, classified, financial institution. They issue bonds, right, to finance gas. But so industry classification technically is a dead end because we're never going to get them accurately measured. And you would have to do an activity classification, one company, 20, 50 activities to get closer to the reality. And then with industry, you have one further problem. Any legislation that goes industry specific is about as good as playing a long ball down the line in football against 4 in the back. The lobbyists in Brussels are just waiting for it. That's how they make their money, right? But industry agnostic legislation is something that is much, much harder to counter lobby because everybody gets treated the same. As soon as you make difference between industry, they'll come against. So I personally am a strong believer that the baseline method needs to be industry agnostic, and then every asset manager can themselves say, I like this industry classification, I like that activity classification, and I'll organize my ranking within a peer group, right? So if a baseline method is industry agnostic, CO2E is the same for everybody, women in top management is the same for everybody, then you can rank them in a peer group. But if the baseline method is industry specific, A, you're making a massive assumption on which classification to use. Most people don't realize that, but the assumption is enormous. And B, it is super easy for the lobbyist to basically slow down any process when we have various different industries where invariably one might get slightly better treated than the other. Yeah. I can bring it.
Thank you. There is a lot of discussion today about how to measure ESG and if ESG is the appropriate way to describe sustainability.
Yeah.
We know that ESG is a development from an old idea of the triple bottom line.
Yeah.
And so P obviously is the social side, planet is the environmental side. But the question is governance representing profit, which is the other P? I hope you agree that in academia, we have not been able to find an association, not even a causal relationship, nor an association between profit and good governance. A profitable company and a well-governed company. There is no consistent conclusion to make that assertion. Yes, we can find a relationship between between governance and the cost of capital, reducing the risk, and enterprise value perhaps, but not profit. So we can say that a company to sustain itself in the long run has to be profitable. But on the other hand, what is the best measure to encapsulate that level of performance? So I would like to hear your views on this. Governance is extremely important, no doubt about that, but are we not going in the right direction by bringing together in a sole concept so many different aspects and dimensions of a company and its sustainability?
Yeah, so I'll answer in 3 steps. First of all, my view is that instead of ESG, we're going to use single real impact outcomes, and we decide how to weigh them. We don't ask Dilbert for the exchange rate between women on the board and CO2. That's the first one. The second one, and anyone who has follow-up questions, because there'll be the last one from time, please do contact me on LinkedIn. I'm very happy to take any questions. Now, you might ask the question to the wrong person. I'm a financial data scientist, not an accountant. There is an early 2000 study by Gompers, Metric and Issue on governance and shareholder value, and there's a lot of other studies showing that governance can create shareholder value. Now, shareholder value is cash flows, de-risking in terms of the risk side, and to an extent investor preferences because you do something that they like. I frankly don't think profit is that important. It's an accounting measure that you can manipulate pretty easily. And the first class that I had as a bachelor student at a corporate German university in accounting was, what is the profit of Bosch, private German company? And that gives my age away, but in 1997 it was 435 million. And in 1998, she asked us, what's the profit? Well, she had no idea, 435 million. And then she asked us in 1999, what's the profit? Now we got it, 435 million. And then in 2000, it was lower because of crisis. But so in principle, obviously, the profit is a figure that the accountants put forward, and it links closely to the discussion about precautionary principle. Are we waiting for the accountants to come up with methods that reflect social, environmental, or governance aspects? The profit has little relation to governance, I agree in that regard. Or will we estimate it from a data science perspective, no matter how fast the accountants are to bring something forward? Obviously, I'm fundamentally biased in saying this. I'm a financial data scientist. I'm not going to wait for the accountants. The accountants had decades to accurately reflect social and environmental and governance information, and by and large, they failed. I will just use data science methods to estimate it. I'll use Sdg Link Bonds to let the market decide which SDGs they want to see for which company, and the accountants will have to argue why they're relevant going forward. As in academia, they do struggle, for instance, in the UK. So not exactly the answer you wanted. I'm pretty sure about that, but that would be my honest view. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Andreas Hoppner, for this very dynamic and insightful presentation. Vamos entrar agora no nosso último painel de discussão com o tema O mercado de capitais ao serviço do desenvolvimento sustentável, o contexto europeu. Para tal, chamo ao palco Alexandra Majinska, diretora executiva da Beta Finance, Pedro Cisa Vieira, advogado e sócio da PLMJ, Robert Roffel, antigo presidente da AMF, e também se junta a nós online Francisco Veloso, sim, diretor da Imperial College Business School. Para moderar o painel, convido André Veríssimo, redator principal do ECO.
Muito boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon. Thanks for our panelists for coming and joining us in this discussion. Well, markets love acronyms. BRICS, the initials for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, were very popular in the beginning of the century. Not anymore. Now the big trend is ESG investing, the initials for environment, social, and governance. By the way, journalists also love acronyms. According to Bloomberg, the value of ESG assets surpassed $35 trillion in 2020 and should reach $50 trillion in 2025, about 1/3 of the total projected assets under management. So the importance of seeing these numbers grow has never been greater, given the financial effort needed for the energy transition, now highlighted in Europe by the consequences of the war in Ukraine. Europe is also facing a growing social challenge and needs to finance policies to address the aging of the population. And sustainability is the topic of this panel. And I will start by asking Alexandra Maczynska. Better finance represents the users of financial service. Should savers and investors be a part of this effort and prefer ESG assets?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting an NGO that represents the interests of financial services users, so savers, pension savers, insurance policy holders, to this debate. I heard very clearly the plea from the last panel to have civil society more involved in general financial reforms also in Portugal. I mean, financial services users and investors are already part of it. Savers and individual investors are really by nature long-term. So they invest and they save for their children's education, they save for the housing, mortgages, and so on. And majority of them really want to invest sustainably when asked about it. And they basically would like to be doing well by doing good. But at the same time, they really expect a return on their investment. Mm-hmm. So this was a very clear message from the European Joint Consumer Protection Day that we held just last week with the European supervisory authorities. And I think when we discuss investments and also sustainable investments, we really need to think about this and also remember about the trust of users in general in financial products and services. The European Commission and the Directorate for Justice has been doing so-called consumer market scoreboard for years, and the trust in financial services was always at the top bottom. So you need to take it into account. Mm-hmm. And even though the investors would like to be part of it and invest sustainably, they in fact are overwhelmed by all the acronyms that you have already mentioned. The Economist recently referred to ESG as the exaggerated, superficial guff. And from what we see from some of the surveys that we have done among individual investors, it is a bit this perspective. And a bit this approach, they feel overwhelmed, they don't really trust when they are advised sustainable finance products. And I think in this respect, we need more clarity and we need really disclosures to investors that are really clear to them and really easily understandable, and I think there we still need to do
a little
more.
Bit more. We will address the topic of trust a little bit more further on our conversation. Pedro, I'll turn to you. We need ESG to work and to be trusted because the scale of the effort is huge.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. The effort is huge. So basically, the goals that the world at large and the European Union in particular have set out to meet a number of challenges, particularly the climate change and the need to make an energy transition, is of a very significant order. The European Commission estimates that in Europe we will need about 480 billion euro of additional investment a year just to finance the transition. And so a lot of effort is being done in the sense of making sure that in addition to public money, and it's going to be very limited in terms of the scale of the whole effort that needs to be done, private investment should be directed to meet the European Green Deal goals. So a lot of effort is being put in respect of making sure that the financial system, the capital markets are geared towards meeting these goals, whether by providing more information which meets the expectations of the demand and investors, which Alexander was talking, also providing that information in terms of making sure that we regulate how the disclosures are made through proposals that are currently in place, but also in respect of regulating the ratings that the ESG ratings that we were talking about, but also forcing the financial system and the banking system to accommodate these concerns in their own assessment of their own portfolios on a macroprudential basis, which in turn will probably force money to flow into this direction. Now, this is something where you're doing well. This is something that you're also trying to make sure that the framework, the framework of the financial markets meets these political goals. And that's where the controversy becomes apparent. And currently, for instance, in the United States, you have serious political discussions about ESG and the use of that. And we can talk about that later.
The state of Texas issued an anti-ESG law.
Well, basically, most Republican states are coming with the anti-ESG laws and making sure that, for instance, ESG asset managers who have ESG metrics cannot enter into agreements with the public entities there, because they say it's political concerns, it's woke culture coming into something which should be only concerned about the pecuniary and the financial performance rather than otherwise. So it can become controversial, but clearly the idea in Europe is that we will pursue this matter. Andreas has talked very clearly about how this will have an impact, not only in the largest companies, but I'm sure that through the banking system will go to SMEs, which will be forced to be much more concerned about these metrics and these topics.
Robert, to develop sustainable finance, the EU has embarked on an ambitious legislative journey that will take several years to complete. Can you take us a little bit through that journey?
Let us try to do it. First of all, I would like to thank CMVM, because, as you know, there is a very strong friendship between the French IMF. I think French IMF, there is a Quebec IMF too. So the French IMF and the CMVM, and I think it's worth mentioning right now. We share many things. We have embarked in the EU indeed in a very ambitious and demanding journey, which is with a phased approach, and it will take almost 10 years to achieve it, almost 10 years. In the meantime, we will have a bumpy road. Of course, I like the idea of using estimates. It's better than nothing, and it's an incentive, but nevertheless, at some point, you need to have some reliability and convergence in the data you use. And by the way, I'd like to mention that ESG rating there is no regulatory framework for them. There is a regulatory framework for credit ratings, but not for ESG rating. It means that conflict of interest, transparency, and whatever, it's not clearly managed, even if in some cases it could be done. But nevertheless, there is a lack there to give it. Of course, surprisingly, the financial institution, the financial sector has been first targeted with SFDR, which has been mentioned, MIFID also with some delegated act, and when at the root of the process, corporates, public issuers should have come first, because that's the basic of what you are investing in. And CSRD is doing this job, but we should have in mind that it will not come in full force before 2029, 2030. That's a fact.
That's long.
When it will be applied to third country companies, unlisted SMEs. When you have an opt-out period of 3 years, means that I suspect that many countries will use this opt-out period. Mm-hmm. So then, there is the issue of the assurance for this data. Should it be only limited assurance or reasonable assurance?
in the reasonable assurance means I signed. It's very demanding. In the first step, it will just be a limited assurance. It means that to have a full force of this regulatory framework, you will wait for around 10 years' time. Doesn't mean that in the meantime you do not have to do something, but it's a bumpy road. We will also have, I think, to coordinate with ESAP. ESAP is the European Single Access Point. It's very important that these data, which will be disclosed through CSRD, would be available in a single access point. And it's possible, but it's yet to be done. And we all know that in the EU it takes some time. That's the EU perspective. But the EU perspective, obviously, is not sufficient. You should put it in the global international perspective. And when you look at the global international perspective, my God, we are much more demanding in the EU than in other jurisdictions. And for some, it means that you will put our own corporation at a disadvantage compared with the others. We will see what will be the outcome of the SEC consultation. But I fear that you have mentioned that. I think in the US there will be some difficulty. When you look at the ISSB, it has been mentioned this morning by from intervention from the European Commission. Of course, we will coordinate, but in the ISSB there is no double materiality, and it's only on climate for the time being. It's not on ESG. And when you look at the ISSB standards, okay, we will have them in a couple of months now. Which jurisdiction will endorse them? Which one? It's still to be seen, and we cannot. So it's a real difficult journey in front of us. There is a sense of urgency, so we do not have to wait for the outcome of all the journey to run, but nevertheless, we should realize that we are just at the beginning of it, and we will need around 10 years to achieve something which will be fully acceptable without any possibility of greenwashing to some extent. Because in the meantime, you always have the possibility to have the greenwashing arriving. Mm-hmm. Let us try to limit it.
Yes. Francisco, are you hearing us fine?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here.
How can universities and academia contribute to this journey?
Thank you very much. I believe that they play actually a very central role, or they can play, and they are playing, and there's different elements related to the conversation that we're already having. You know, one, and I'll start there, has to do with this issue of greenwashing. You know, we can have, one of the advantages of academia is precisely to have you know, a more independent view, to look at, for example, you know, what are the metrics that are working or not working, what indexes, you know, seem to be doing their job or not doing their job, what are the elements that need to be driven. Can also, you know, start to look at, you know, a variety of opportunities, because when we think about this transition, there is, you know, this element of the risk and return, but there are actually quite fundamental changes that need to be implemented and need to be understood. And that has to do with risk. You know, when we look at financial markets and historically the way that we measure risk, it tends to be mostly backward looking and looking at historical data to try to understand what happens to risk, while most of the climate risk in particular is forward looking. So changing that structure so that we may be able to do much more forward looking in the way that we think and measure risk is something that academia is already making a very significant contribution and will continue to do so. At Imperial, you know, we created 5 years ago a center on climate finance and investment to look at these various issues, one of the areas that we've been doing a lot of work is risk in general. For example, how do you bring climate scenarios into the way that you understand financial risk to make it much more mainstream? That's one area that we've been looking a lot, and also with specific elements. So, for example, we have a partnership with Singapore Management University to look at infrastructure risk in Southeast Asia and how that is being affected through climate change, and what does that mean for regional markets is one example of the kinds of things that we can do. And the other part is to think about solutions and opportunities. We just published a recent report, for example, looking at adaptation bonds and how can we create adaptation bonds that can work on local markets, in the US, for example, but also in Europe, in other areas. So to think on and imagine new products that financial institutions can take on and push forward and develop in important ways. And this is all part of changing the picture of our understanding of the risk-return trade-off so that we can make more informed decisions, which in our view are going to be much more sustainable-oriented decision. But as my colleagues have pointed out, the gap is huge. I mean, we're just talking about the volume of investment annually that has to be done in the EU that was just mentioned by Pedro before me. I mean, if you think about that at a global scale, we're talking about something on the order of $3 to $4 trillion per year on financing that transition. So there's a big gap, and we are at the most, now thinking something on the order of about $1 trillion. So the gap is quite significant. The final bit that I just wanted to also refer to is not just about the research, not just about evaluating what's working and not working. It's, of course, the educational mission of the university. We need to prepare a set of new generations of finance professionals that understand these issues, that understand the unknowns, that understand the trade-offs, and are at the cutting edge of driving this transition. And a few years ago, we created a master's precisely in this area. And interestingly, we thought it was going to be a very narrow master's that looks just at climate finance. So we thought it was going to be a small program with 30 to 40 people. But over the last 3 or 4 years, it's grown so much that's now a full-fledged program, which for us means 80 or 90 students. And we're now actually thinking that potentially we're going to double stream it, because there's so much interest and so much appetite on the younger generations to better understand the tools, the opportunities, the challenges, so that they can contribute and make a difference. So assessment of what's working and not working, coming up with new solutions and new products that the market can explore and take on, and educating the next generation are critical roles that the university is and should be having now and in the future.
Mm-hmm. Alexandra, this almost deluge of planned regulation that we're going to have in the next years, could it make the process too costly with negative consequences for investor returns, or is it really necessary?
Yeah, the question maybe could be whether it's dilute. Probably you're also right to call it like that. For us, the more important issue would be whether the legislation that is proposed is really fit for purpose when it comes to retail investors. For us, fit for purpose would mean that thanks to this new proposals, the investor would finally get an information that is clear, that is understandable, and also comparable, so that they really can make well-informed decisions while investing their money. We know already in the previous two panels, this was also the topic of the discussion, that Europeans, and it's not only people in Portugal, are not really investing their money. Even if they have savings, they are not investing them. Mm-hmm. And this was one of the goals of really big flagship project of the European Commission, so the Capital Markets Union, that cannot be called a success, to put it mildly, at least not yet. So when we are talking about the ESG investments, sustainable investments, green investments, I think we really need to all the time think about that people are really afraid to invest. They don't quite understand the investment process. They don't really also understand the process of investment advice. Quite often when they need an advisor, they just go to the bank, assuming they're receiving an independent advice. So when it comes to the legislation, the thing is that there is a very good rule in the EU law that says that the information that an individual receives should be clear, first and foremost. And what clear means, it's even defined, that this information should be easily understandable to an average member of the group to which it is directed, or a member of the group that is likely to receive it. And probably it is the really least enforced rule of the EU law, unfortunately, and it has consequences on the current state of affairs. So we would first like to see change in that. And then you have also ESG disclosures, so they should make the process for the retail investor easier. So the disclosure should make it easier for him to understand what he is dealing with and the investment. And we just have some statistics from the survey that has been, and study that has been done from, by the Warsaw School of Economics about the current templates for ESG disclosures. And unfortunately, it shows that almost 50% of the people, and these were actually young people, it seemed familiar with the idea or the concept of sustainable investments, and also the ones that are studied, either economics or financial issues, that almost 50% of them perceive the pre-contractual documents much too detailed and too long. Almost, I think, also 50% not really even understand well the icons used in the graphic representation of the information on the document that was, of course, used in order to make the things easier for them. So basically, the situation does not look good right now. And also what would be, from our perspective, quite important when you talk about the information disclosed to retail investors about sustainability, ideally it should not really be one additional document that people need to deal with and read. And I think that it would be quite important also for the law to have one short, easily understandable disclosure document that would give the investor a holistic view of the investment. So both information about the financial information and non-financial information included into one.
Pedro, this seems to be a game only for big companies. How can we foster adoption of ESG in smaller companies?
Well, that's a very good question. Just a comment. We are making these disclosures so complex that sometimes people will say, I will not invest in any instrument because it's so complicated that I don't understand what I'm doing.
And time consuming.
So yeah, from a consumer and as a retail investor perspective. But you're right. So basically, this started to be a capital markets thing, with investors having concerns about the impact of their investment and making sure that they are doing environmentally conscious investments. You wanted more, you started to direct some products into companies which had very good. So, and we have now a directive on non-financial reporting, which is basically geared towards large companies, listed companies, financial institutions, regulated businesses, and it's about 11,000 companies in Europe that are forced to it. When we go to the corporate sustainability reporting directive, we are going to all non-SME companies, and we're going to listed SMEs to be in the scope of these reporting obligations. Just to give you an idea, just in Portugal, we have in excess of 1,000 non-SMEs, 1,200 non-SMEs. So just in Portugal, we're going to have 10% of the current universe. So it's a very huge effort that CSRD requires. And the other thing is that currently this is more of a capital markets issue, and we discussed about, you clearly need more transparency You clearly need, from an investor perspective, on the information you get. If you're interested in investing in sustainable activities, sustainable companies, environmentally conscious companies, you need to make sure that you have enough information so that the market is transparent. When you start to go into areas such as, the banking system needs also to report on this, needs to have targets in terms of how their portfolio is impacted by some ESG risks, or what the impact of their credits have in society at large, the double materiality test that Robert was talking about. Then we are getting into the bulk of the financing of the whole European economy, which will in turn trigger some adaptation by the market at large. So what my point is that what the European Union is doing, it is going much further than the SEC, which is having a proposal on disclosure, but just for climate issues and basically for companies which have issues which are subject to SEC. ISSB is the same universe and the same scope, whilst in the European Union we're going to be much broader in terms of the range and the scope of companies which will be required to disclose, and we're putting pressure on the whole of the financial system. And the idea is that we will use this to make sure that we gear private investment into the Green Deal goals and the Sustainable Development Objectives goals. That's the effort which the European Union is making. It has passed a very prescriptive taxonomy regulation, which says which things are favorable to the environment and which are not, which will make, given all the articulation with all pieces of legislation, will make capital easier to raise if you're in accordance with the taxonomy, but more difficult to raise or get debt financing if you're not in accordance with the taxonomy. The taxonomy has concepts which then is translated into that famous definition which Andreas talked about, the do no significant harm, which means that even if you're not, you have to be doing no significant harm to the environmental goals or the social goals. And to be honest, it's very difficult to know what this is. I've had discussions about what this means in practice because, for instance, the National Recovery and Resilience Plans have an obligation that they are not going to finance projects or companies which do not meet the do no significant harm test, and this has to be audited and certified, and nobody knows how to certify or audit this. So this is very, very stringent, and the time frame that we are working towards a reduction of 55% of emissions by 2030 requires us to go very fast, and we have to deal with all this body of legislation that is coming in a very short period of time.
Mm-hmm. Robert, could this more demanding stance by the EU create a competition problem?
As it has been just mentioned, it's very demanding and very specific to the EU. By the way, starting 2020-29, these requirements will also apply to a third country company having activities in the EU if their own system is not deemed to be equivalent. Mm-hmm. And I can't see how they could be deemed as being equivalent, taking into account what we have taken as a definition of ESG. Nobody is equivalent to our definition of ESG right now. And I very much doubt that in 2029
there will be.
There will be. So it's something which will be very costly. It's absolutely clear. Costly for all the chain, starting by the companies, which needs to disclose things and have these things audited at some point with a reasonable assurance, which is not quite easy, but and it's also costly for all the financial intermediaries, which needs to have the ability to deal with this type of issue. And it's absolutely clear that right now, data providers are making money on this type of issues. That's also why, at some point, I've mentioned the ESAP, the European Single Access Point, which will be key in order to give free access to this data for all the people involved in this area. But will it be something which will be detrimental to the competitivity of the European corporates? We will see, but to some extent there is always a trade-off, because to some extent for international investors, having some reliability on the data, on the investments they could do, is something which is valuable.
Can reduce the cost
it's
of capital.
valuable. It's valuable. And at the end of the day, when you will have, for the banking system, for example, this climate stress test or whatever, if it can be done on a reliable basis, it's very worth. It's worth the cost. So there is a balance between all of that, but it's absolutely clear that the story is not over, because we will see when we'll try when we'll start to implement some of these regulations which are in the pipe and which are on a very I should say phased approach. You have mentioned SMEs, but what will be asked to SMEs is not the same granularity on what will be asked to the others. That's why on CSRD there is 3 steps for implementation in order to have time to develop the standards for the middle-sized companies. But it will be a bumpy road, absolutely. And one issue which is still to be discussed is what's the liability, what's the risk. When you disclose something, if you are wrong, if you miss something, could you be sued? What will be the stance of the supervisor on this one? At what time do you need to disclose a change in your policy? This type of issues is a concern for many corporates, and that's also why in some cases we have seen that voluntary commitments, they have taken a step back, because committing means, to some extent, if you do not deliver, you could be sued. Oh my God!
You could be held accountable.
Exactly. That's this type of issue, which is key. Because if you commit, of course you should deliver.
Should be.
And if you miss, you should disclose very rapidly that you will miss your target. It's the same thing for financial disclosure. Yeah. When you give some guidance on your earning, on your EBITDA or whatever, if you know that you will meet them, you should disclose. But all these issues need to be settled in order to have to make all the chain comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Can I break order for 30 seconds just to say 3 things? First, change is massive and it is required. So going forward as it was before is not going to do the thing. So we need to force change. The second is, when our GPD came, I don't know what the English acronym is, when it came forward about data protection, everyone said no one in Europe will be able to cope, no one outside Europe will respect this. And then it became a global standard. And I believe that the access to the internal market in the European Union is incentive enough for companies from third countries to do so. And the third is that we actually need to do this, because what is happening now is that our internal market, which is the greatest market in the world in terms of size, is being used against European producers. European producers are subject to social and environmental standards, which third country producers do not meet, so they have lower costs, and still they put their products in Europe and make competition against the European producers. So, making sure that these standards are global, or at least are imposed to those who want to have access to our internal market, it's absolutely critical.
Oh, that's
Because Europe still has that power to impose
that's
global standards.
2029, but it's...
Yes, but we need to start
we
making
need that.
decisive. But it's huge. It's going to be massive.
Francisco, I would like also to talk about how the current environment that we're having of an energy crisis, high inflation, rising interest rates may affect ESG investment. What's your perspective?
So thank you. Just a comment on the previous question, which I think is quite important on two dimensions. One is that we are seeing. I think the transition is going to be quite. Sometimes it's going to be surprising and perhaps faster than we think, because there's increasing evidence, and some of our academics have been involved in that on how much the markets are now. Pricing the climate risk and the companies that are exposed to climate risk. And so the more this starts to tighten, especially if the regulation is done well, as just been mentioned by Pedro and by Robert, this is going to bite perhaps quicker than one thinks. The other aspect that I just wanted to highlight is the importance of supply chains and private markets, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about the public markets, but I think it's very important to realize that as big companies start to think about scope 3, they're going to look at their suppliers and start to say, wait a minute, you need to do something differently if you want to supply to me, because precisely I'm subject to all these regulations and all these risks are being very visible. And so you need to start doing things in a different way if you want to continue to supply to me. And that's one important aspect of that transmission into the smaller companies that I think will become very visible. The other aspect is the role of private markets, and of course, the European Investment Bank and others are starting to create instruments around, in particular, private equity, which is an initiative that I'm also close to and contributing to, that are starting to see facilities, solutions, opportunities to enter the market with products, with funds that will have those elements at heart. And I believe we'll start to capture the attention both on the investment side, but also on those that are going to be receiving that investment. And so I think that's another channel that I think is going to be quite important to diffuse this issue into the broader market beyond the regulated public markets that we've been discussing. Now, getting into your question about the current environment and how it's affecting, or it might affect, I think, of course, there is going to be some, I think, countervailing forces that are going to be at play here. So certainly, high inflation and high interest rates are going to create budget pressures on governments, and that's going to make it harder for them to invest in some of these transitions. It's going to make it harder to raise capital. We're already seeing that, and therefore, given what we just discussed before about how big the investment needs to be, this is, of course, a source of concern, because of the financial and budgetary pressures that exist both on private companies but also on governments. At the same time, there are aspects that are going to be changing the dial on a different direction, which is the fact that energy security has gained a very different stance given what's happening in Ukraine and the difficulties with the supplies from Russia that come with the war. And that means that there's going to be more involvement in the government in creating alternative sources of energy that will be, much more friendly towards the environment because of the regulations and the requirements that we've just discussed. And so that's more direct involvement, but also in terms of guarantees, because now, if you realize that there is an energy security issue, the way that you're going to be offering some guarantees for the downside risk, the types of products and the types of solutions that are going to be created in partnership with the private sector, I think are going to have different characteristics because of this energy security issue, and that may create a different opportunity. The biggest source of concern that I have that comes out of this adverse economic context has to do with not so much on the investment that happens in this case in the context of Europe, but the responsibilities outside of Europe, because we know that we cannot move towards net zero without very, very substantive investments in places like Africa and China or India in particular, or the whole coal transition in China and in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa, it's absolutely central to meet net zero. And it's very important, the effort that some of the governments and private corporations have done to start to help the transition in these countries, but with much more significant budgetary pressures that are going to happen in Europe. What's going to happen to the instruments that could be deployed for these parts of the world to help their transition? I mean, we need to step up to a very different level. And my concern is that with the current economic environment, that's not going to go up, it's going to go down. And that's a problem. And that's a problem because we need it for environmental reason, but even for economic reasons. You know, one of our academics, Patrick Bolton, has just finished a very interesting study looking at what would happen, what would be this overall social benefits if we would phase out coal around the world. And if you do the accounting at all levels, it can actually generate something like $78 trillion of social benefits. So the overall goal and the benefits that would come out of that are huge. Now, the economic environment is going to make that journey more challenging, and this is a big source of concern, given, of course, what we want to achieve in terms of our Paris commitment. So that's, you know, a little bit of kind of the various elements that I think are at play with regards to the transition and what we need to do and how it's being affected by the current economic environment.
Alexandra, what's your take on this subject? Investors and savers can become more risk adverse in the next years and less willing to invest in financial products as ESG products? Or they will be more willing because they sense they are more long-term profitable?
Yes, in terms of risk, I think there were also a couple of very interesting and right statements in the previous panels about risk and about people, the need of making people and savers aware of the necessity to take the risk in terms if they want to have a decent pension adequacy in the future. Mm-hmm. And we have to talk about it also when it comes to sustainable investments. And the thing is that people, when they invest money, in general, they really expect a return on that. And in order to really have a proper, for example, decent pension in the future, the return has to be significantly positive. And with that, there has been a problem in the past already. We, as Better Finance, every year we publish a report on the real return of long-term pension savings. And the situation for savers in Europe looks rather grim. For the first time this year, we wanted also to look whether or not when you invest for pension, you get reliable information and you get in disclosure on green investments that are taken into account for your pension. And it, again, doesn't look too good. The report is going to be published on Thursday, so I invite you to visit our website to have more details. But in general, we really are afraid of the impact of greenwashing on the ability and the willingness of people to invest. Mm-hmm. In general, but in particular in sustainable investment products. Our German national organization representing the interest of German retail investors had a survey done among their members, because as of August this year, financial advisors are obliged to also ask about sustainability preferences of retail investors. And it turned out that most of the people, so over 60% of those that took part in the survey, in the end did not take the advice that they were giving during the advice process. Most of investors at the beginning were interested really in sustainable investments, but many of them are really afraid that it means that they are going to be charged more just because an investment is called a sustainable one or ESG one, even though at least 30% really wanted to have at least 20% of their portfolio invested in green assets. What they were also concerned about is, and what we are concerned about, that only 60 of them received information about cost during the advice process. And I think this should be really looked at from, again, a bit holistic perspective, because apart from the fact whether or not people are right about greenwashing, and they are, they also lack really basic information, basic financial information about returns. Many pension savers do not receive such information. When we are trying to do also the job for them and disclose, we really have huge problems with finding publicly available information on that. And I think if you want people to invest sustainably, you really need to inform them about the real return that they can expect. And ESG ratings were mentioned. I quite often hear that actually ESG ratings are not that important, that we don't need the regulatory framework for them. I disagree. I very much support ESMA's opinion on that, and I would like really to see a proper regulatory framework for that. And even though maybe not many investors, really retail investors, have even the possibility to buy a license to get the full information from ESG rating, I would really like to see a more impact of those ratings and to have a credibility that is more comparable to credit ratings. And I know that this comparison is also not exactly appropriate, because credit ratings are, of course, based on information that the companies are obliged to, mandatory disclosures, which is not the case in ESG ratings. But I think we definitely need more transparency in them, because as Better Finance, we have done research on ESG ratings, and we found, as many other organizations and institutes that have been looking into that, that there is almost 50% of disalignment between different ratings. And I think for retail investors to hear that one fund can be rated as A or super green by one rating provider, and on the contrary, on the other bottom of the scale by another one, is just contributing to general distrust in financial services and sustainable on top.
So investors are yet not convinced.
Not convinced. They are very interested, but they are not convinced.
Not
exactly.
Convinced. Pedro, I don't know if you want to comment on the impact that in the current economic scenario may have on ESG investing.
Well, I think that what we're talking about are long-term and mid-term things and investments that need to be made in any case. And the current situation is a situation where we will see an adjustment in the levels of interest rates. It shouldn't surprise anyone. We shouldn't expect that interest rates would be negative forever. It's about inflation and trying to cope with inflation. This is not something that is going to influence long-term decisions. It's going to stop some investment decisions right now, but it's not going to change the course. The second thing is, it's not very difficult. You don't have to be very financially savvy to say, I'm going to invest in renewables. I'm going to invest in systems for storage of electricity. I'm going to invest in industrials and life science. That's very basic.
It's almost a no-brainer.
It's a no-brainer, because these things will fly and will be very significant in the future. The topic is, all these packages of legislation are in the making. They are still not very clear, and I'm concerned about transition. Let me give you an example. I have now a fund which says I am investing in sustainable companies. And suddenly you start to discuss, is this greenwashing? Is the information available really that? And then comes a delegated act from the Commission or a new regulation which says, actually, you only consider these things to be sustainable, others will not. What will happen to the funds which are invested in a fund which suddenly is not 100% sustainable? Will those devalue? What will happen? Access to capital. For the foreseeable future, we will continue to have to invest in trucks, in airplanes, and the like. But the changes that are going to be made are going to push capital away from these activities and will make the cost of capital much more expensive while we still need these things to happen. So these transitional topics are topics that need to be addressed. I'm not hesitant about the pace of scale, and to be honest, I think that as Andreas was suggesting, we shouldn't be focusing on ESG ratings as a whole, but we should look at how a company is actually delivering on environment, how it's delivering on its social impact, how it's delivering on its governance, and not mix things, avoid the Dilbert play, and make sure that we know exactly what is being done and how companies are actually performing in respect of the things which I believe are more critical. And these things, another question, are extremely difficult. Let me give you an example. You want to go for an electrical economy, the electrification of the economy. You're going to have need of massive investments which require natural resources. You will need lithium and cobalt for batteries. You will need copper for electrical wirings. These will have to be extracted. They can be recycled, but we need to extract much more. So what happens if you're a mining company and you are in an industry which by definition has an impact on ecosystems, on the landscape, on the communities? You can address these things, each one of them, better. You can deal better with the communities. You can be extremely concerned about how your extraction process and how you use the water is done. But you will need these resources. Otherwise, you will not be able to get to an energy transition as you need. So we need to make sure that all these frameworks will not impact on the cost of capital to make sure that we access the lithium, the cobalt, or the copper that we need, whilst at the same, which are clearly needed for the overall overarching climate goals, whilst at the same time making sure that the cost of capital for these activities is not jeopardized by having a taxonomy or a rating which mix all things together. That's my concern.
Some brown activities are important and crucial for the green activities.
No, it's a very good point. Actually, what we need to finance is a transition. We will see next year what will be the taxonomy aligned proportion of the economy. It will be 2 to 3%, something like that. That's not the issue. That's not what you want to finance. What you want to finance is a transition. And by the way, of course, we do no longer have negative interest rate. But in real terms, we do. We do, and by much. So let us see what will be the outcome of them when we will have positive real interest rate. We will see. It's not done. Just perhaps 2 quick points. The very first one is that during this transition, let's say the 5 to 10 years in front of us in the EU, with a single market for financial products, passporting right, automatic passporting right, we need to harmonize the way the directive will be transposed. We need to align the way the regulation will be implemented and how it will be supervised. Because what we have in front of us is 27 way of implementing this type of approach. And there is so many uncertainties that it will be a very challenging for ESMA to harmonize that. But it is, and it should be, but it is on the top of its agenda. Because if not, at the end, it's the end of the single market, which is behind that. The second point, and last one, is the international developing countries issue is very huge. And to some extent, if we have right now a climate change issue, it's due to what has been done by the already developed countries. So they are telling us, why should I be penalized by what you have done in the last 20 to 50 years. So you have to pay for us to subsidize our way of going to net zero. And to some extent, you could debate, but something should be done. Something should be done. Perhaps the World Bank or something like that should be, but it's a legitimate issue. And by the way, when we are talking on this issue, it means that the US will have to pay. So that's that's very challenging.
Tough discussions. But Robert, I just wanted also to ask you if investors, companies, and governments are focusing, well, they are focusing a lot on the E, but are they forgetting the S and the G? We're paying too little attention to those dimensions. That will be also crucial for Europe.
It's a step-by-step approach. And as you have seen, there is a taxonomy for part of E. Should we have a taxonomy for S? Should we have a taxonomy for G? The approach of G in the EU is totally different from the G in the US, for example, because the culture are different. Even from one country to another, there could be some difference. But it's crystal clear that G should be in the picture. G should be in the picture because to some extent you have the governance of E and S is also part of the story. Mm-hmm. So it should be, but perhaps you should be more prudent on this one. Somebody has mentioned that we need to prioritize. Mm-hmm. And the priority right now is climate change. I'm sorry about that.
Francisco, do you share Robert's opinion, or should we be focusing more on the S and the G?
Well, I think that it will take steps. I mean, Robert, I think, was very, very careful, laying out the fact that this is a step by step, even on the E side, and that's certainly the reality on the S and the G. I would kind of make two comments related to that. One is that there are increasingly aspects of the E and the S that are going to be related. For example, via the health side, there's increasing evidence about the impact that, for example, in cities and regions, the environmental conditions have on the health of the populations, and the impacts through that on national, health systems, etc., on population health. We have here at Imperial a big study relating precisely the climate in cities with the health side and the implications that it has. And so some of those are tightly connected, and that's where I think there will be a faster evolution in terms of the incorporations of the social in connections with the environmental aspects. And that will be part of that step-by-step approach. I mean, other aspects related to social, like inequality and opportunities, etc., I think will take a little bit longer. The governance, I agree very much with the point that Robert made about the fact that the G is there because I think we all believe, at least certainly I do believe, that you need good governance to make sure that you're incorporating the E and the S in the way that you're making decisions in the company side. And so I think that is going to be the important connection, which I think that companies that pay the right attention into the way that they structure their governance to make sure that the aspects related to the social and the environmental are incorporated in the board level decisions and in the structures that percolate through the organizations, are going to be able to make better decisions on the E and the S. And so I think that cycle of connection will play out in a virtuous cycle in a very positive way. But it will take time from the point of view of bringing that, I think, to the perhaps to the public markets, in the sense that can we have indexes that are broadly accepted on the S and on the G that we can really work on, especially that it can work internationally and that people can recognize, that's going to be tougher. It will make it there, will evolve, but it will take time. The one aspect that I think is important is that we do have intermediate steps on the S and on the G, but certainly on the S, that we need to consider. And that has to do with instruments like impact investment. So the difference is that many corporates and foundations and pension funds can have deliberate S objectives in terms of the way that they structure their investments, in some ways through impact investment, where they're saying, I want to have impact, say, in the welfare of this population, or in this group, or in this economic activity, or in this element of distribution. And that's going to be part of my goals in terms of impact investment. And we're seeing a lot of very interesting innovations and evolutions on that side, as a way to not have to wait to have standards or metrics that everybody, or that a broad fraction of the market can accept, and still make important progress. And I think that the role of impact investment as an intermediate step is quite important on our journey towards having a more comprehensive view on the S&G in the way that we think about this investment.
You want to add something, Alexandra?
Very shortly. I would very much agree with the last point, but also with the previous point about the need to invest in transition. Individual investors are very much interested in impacting the transition, and they would really like, and they would like to be able to really engage with the companies they are already invested in. And one important channel for them is, of course, to use the General Assembly. Unfortunately, still, it's extremely difficult for them to use the rights, and extremely difficult, especially in the cross-border environment. And the second point, the impact investing. Most of the investors who want to invest sustainably want to see impact. And I think one of the AMF studies also confirmed that close to 70% people really want to see impact. So we also very much agree that impact investing could be one of the answers to the problems and criticism that ESG is facing, which is mostly lack of measurement and lack of accountability.
Mm-hmm. We have to close, so it's going to be a long journey, but with some challenges along the way, but that we have to walk. Thanks, Alexandra. Thanks, Pedro. Thanks, Roberto. Thanks, Francisco.
Thank you to all the speakers and the moderator, André Verissimo, for the richness of the different perspectives shared here today. Estamos quase a finalizar a conferência, mas antes convido a subir ao palco Rui Pinto, administrador da CMVM, para fazer as conclusões e encerramento deste dia.
Boa tarde. Senhoras e senhores participantes que nos seguem aqui na sala e à distância, também online, senhoras e senhores oradores e moderadores, aproximamos-nos do fim da nossa Conferência Anual e gostaria agora de partilhar convosco algumas reflexões e breves notas de conclusão. Ao longo deste dia, debatemos a importância da poupança e os instrumentos que podem e devem conduzir à formação da poupança no país. Em primeiro lugar, é importante considerar a perspectiva do cidadão. É ao forrador e ao investidor que nos dirigimos em primeiro lugar para sublinhar a extrema relevância da poupança. A poupança das famílias pode estar dirigida à aquisição de habitação ou de outros bens duradouros, para cobrir despesas inesperadas para a educação, para atenuar quebras de rendimento associadas à inatividade ou reforma, para a suavização de padrões de consumo ao longo do tempo ou de outros objetivos específicos. Mas, sobretudo, a poupança deve assumir um caráter de longo prazo, o que exige disciplina, exige empenho, além de, naturalmente, um nível de rendimento que permita poupar. Esta combinação de condições ajuda a explicar o baixo nível de poupança em Portugal e em outros países que nos são próximos. Sendo o diagnóstico óbvio, as consequências são, no entanto, graves. Os efeitos do déficit crónico de poupança das famílias portuguesas estão encaminhados para se fazerem sentir num futuro próximo pela queda dos rendimentos de uma parte significativa da população após a sua aposentação. Um objetivo central de qualquer sistema de pensões é assegurar que os seus beneficiários recebem um rendimento adequado a quando da sua reforma. A generalidade dos países da União Europeia, incluindo Portugal, apresentam um sistema público de pensões baseado na premissa Pay as you go, no qual as pensões atuais são financiadas diretamente por contribuições da população empregada. O crescimento da produtividade e da população ativa são condições necessárias para assegurar a sustentabilidade desse sistema. É por isso que o fraco crescimento económico exibido na última década e a contínua inversão da pirâmide etária têm reduzido o fator de substituição entre os salários e as pensões oferidas na reforma em várias economias europeias, entre as quais a portuguesa. Mesmo tomando como referência as projeções demográficas mais otimistas, o fator de substituição deverá reduzir-se significativamente nas próximas décadas em Portugal. O crescimento do endividamento dos setores público e privado também reduz a capacidade do Estado para equilibrar o sistema com recurso à emissão de dívida pública. Colocam-se assim dúvidas sobre se o atual sistema público será capaz de assegurar um nível de pensões adequado para os futuros pensionistas. Neste contexto é essencial que os cidadãos conheçam estes cenários e as alternativas ao seu dispor, de forma que façam escolhas adequadas em todas as fases do seu ciclo de vida. Do ponto de vista macroeconómico, a poupança interna é necessária para financiar o investimento e para corrigir potenciais desequilíbrios das contas externas. No contexto português, este agregado macroeconómico assume particular relevância, dada a incapacidade da nossa economia em gerar fundos para financiar despesas de investimento, colocando-a em excessiva dependência do financiamento externo. De facto, as últimas 2 décadas foram marcadas por uma diminuição significativa da poupança das famílias. É de assinalar que a quebra foi transversal a várias economias europeias, pelo que poderá ter resultado parcialmente de alterações macroeconómicas resultantes da introdução do euro e da consequente redução das taxas de juros. A progressiva financialização das economias também poderá ter reforçado essa tendência, na medida em que a crescente oferta de crédito permitiu às famílias a antecipação de consumo e de compra de habitação com menor recurso a fundos próprios. Porém, é também notório o crescimento da divergência dos padrões de poupança das famílias portuguesas por comparação com a média da zona euro. Mesmo que durante a pandemia a taxa de poupança das famílias tenha atingido níveis inauditos nos últimos anos, cerca de 13%, nos últimos meses, e muito fruto do exigente enquadramento geoeconómico em que vivemos, a guerra e a inflação em particular, essa mesma taxa registrou um significativo decréscimo face à média do período entre 2015 e 2019 e situava-se em 5,9% no final de agosto de 2022. Acresce que o atual contexto geoeconómico irá colocar pressão adicional sobre a poupança já constituída, dadas as necessidades acrescidas de liquidez em consequência da perda real de rendimentos. Veja-se a este propósito o alerta recentemente emitido pelo ISRB, inaudito por ser a primeira vez que tal sucede, chamando a atenção para que praticamente todos os segmentos do sistema financeiro da União Europeia estão sujeitos a riscos severos ou elevados. Por tudo isto, é urgente inverter a tendência atual. O aumento da poupança privada de longo prazo poderá atenuar os efeitos da quebra de rendimentos na reforma. Esta solução tem sido defendida por organizações supranacionais, como a OCDE, e nesse contexto, o desenho de novas medidas para fomentar a poupança privada de longo prazo ou otimizar as atualmente existentes assume particular relevância. Os incentivos financeiros à poupança de longo prazo podem ter um papel central, designadamente através de vantagens fiscais e subsídios apropriados com o intuito de a tornar mais atrativa. A intervenção pública encontra justificação também na literatura sobre finanças comportamentais, a qual enfatiza a impaciência dos indivíduos perante o dilema de consumir ou de poupar, o denominado present bias. Dito de outro modo, a maioria dos indivíduos prefere a gratificação imediata, descurando os benefícios associados à poupança de longo prazo. Os incentivos fiscais teriam o objetivo de tornar a poupança de longo prazo mais atrativa, deslocando as preferências dos indivíduos para o ótimo social, desse modo contrariando este enviesamento comportamental. O sistema fiscal português já consagra um conjunto de benefícios fiscais para a poupança de longo prazo, quer no que se refere a fundos de pensões, quer para fundos ou planos de poupança, reforma, incluindo o sistema público de capitalização. Aguarda-se ainda o regime fiscal que irá ser adotado para o Produto Individual de Reforma Pan-Europeu, o PEP, que se trata de um produto de investimento de longo prazo, complementar dos sistemas públicos e de pensões nacionais e que tem como traços essenciais a portabilidade transfronteiriça e a possibilidade de alteração do respectivo prestador à escala europeia. Mas, apesar da sua relevância, as medidas para aumentar a poupança de médio e de longo prazo deverão ir além da componente fiscal. A título ilustrativo, medidas que contribuam para o aumento da competição da oferta no setor financeiro podem ter efeitos positivos para o consumidor através de uma diminuição de custos ou do aumento da qualidade da oferta. A promoção de novos produtos mais ajustados à procura também pode desempenhar um efeito catalisador. Além destas, medidas para incrementar a escolaridade da população e a literacia financeira, particularmente em alguns segmentos específicos, seriam igualmente relevantes, dada a influência que a escolaridade e a literatura financeira têm sobre a poupança. Resultados empíricos recentes para Portugal confirmam esta associação. Estes resultados evidenciam igualmente a importância do rendimento e do escalão etário na formação da poupança, o que justifica a relevância de propostas associadas ao rendimento que visem incentivos à poupança de longo prazo. Resta-me sublinhar o papel essencial que o mercado de capitais pode desempenhar neste processo de poupança e da prossecução de objetivos pessoais, nacionais e globais de médio e longo prazo. Só há desenvolvimento sustentável quando se satisfazem as necessidades do presente, sem comprometer a capacidade de gerações futuras satisfazerem as suas próprias necessidades, garantindo o equilíbrio entre o crescimento económico, o cuidado com o ambiente e o bem-estar social. O cuidado com as pessoas e o seu ambiente exige uma mudança de atitude e uma decisiva transformação digital. Em 2020, a humanidade consumia 1,6 planetas Terra, ou seja, estamos a endividar-nos no que respeita ao consumo de recursos do globo. É, pois, preciso reformular métodos de trabalho e de produção, inovar na utilização de recursos e matérias-primas. O mercado de capitais atua como elemento de financiamento de empresas e de projetos, sendo um elemento fundamental na transição necessária a um desenvolvimento sustentável. A inclusão de elementos de sustentabilidade nas decisões de investimento, com vista ao aumento do financiamento e investimento de longo prazo em projetos e atividades económicas sustentáveis, as finanças sustentáveis, será um dos motores de transformação. Claro que a consideração destes elementos acarreta desafios e riscos, acima de tudo, por ser exatamente uma mudança de paradigma, ou seja, tem associada incerteza e desconhecimento. Mas esta é uma oportunidade que é, ao mesmo tempo, uma necessidade. A Comissão Europeia prevê uma necessidade de investimentos anuais de cerca de 170 a 290 mil milhões de euros para atingir emissões zero na economia. As dificuldades dos investidores terão que ser ultrapassadas com informação e aconselhamento, e as empresas e stakeholders do mercado terão que se comprometer com este propósito. A CMVM está há muito comprometida com as finanças sustentáveis, sendo esta uma das suas prioridades estratégicas. Se soubermos aproveitar a oportunidade, a poupança poderá ter um papel fundamental na transformação. Para isso, teremos que alterar o atual paradigma da poupança, no que concerne à sua dispersão pelos diversos instrumentos financeiros a que os aforradores podem aceder. O cenário atual revela uma concentração significativa em depósitos bancários, sugerindo uma elevada aversão ao risco dos investidores nacionais. Porém, este é o momento de apostar em projetos inovadores. O mercado de capitais saberá certamente oferecer produtos com perfis de risco adaptados a cada perfil de investidor. Aumentando a taxa e diversificando a aplicação da poupança, usando o mercado de capitais como via de geração de riqueza, pelo financiamento da inovação e do desenvolvimento sustentável, podemos ter uma alteração significativa na qualidade de vida individual e coletiva. E é a alteração significativa da qualidade de vida da nossa sociedade que nos move e para a qual todos trabalhamos. É este o nosso propósito último, é para ele que trabalhamos e continuaremos a trabalhar. Não queria terminar sem algumas notas de agradecimento. Um agradecimento a todos os participantes que optaram por passar connosco parte do seu dia. Espero que esta sessão tenha sido de valor acrescentado. Aos oradores e moderadores por aceitarem o convite para partilharem connosco as suas opiniões e perspectivas, que nos ajudaram na reflexão que todos temos que fazer sobre esta temática essencial. E gostaria de deixar uma última palavra à equipa da CMVM, que com enorme dedicação e competência permitiram a montagem de todo este evento com todo o sucesso que teve. Muito obrigado a todos.
Muito obrigada, Rui Pinto. Agora sim, chegámos ao fim e espero que tenham apreciado a nossa Conferência Anual. Em nome da CMVM, reitero aqui os agradecimentos a todos os oradores, convidados e participantes e uma boa tarde para todos. Obrigada.